Just for everyone's awareness, we have started the recording. So I would like to thank everyone for attending today. This is our April event, CPD in 43, the importance of drainage surveying from the NADC. We have Martin, who's going to be talking us through this. We will be sharing some slides for all registered attendees. Martin can also confirm if there are any possibilities of having CPD certificates, etc. And he will be going into a lot more detail in regards to the this drainage. And there will obviously be a question and answer session towards the end. So please do ask any questions you have at that time. Add them into the chat box as usual. Please do also answer the poll, which is in the polls section of the Teams environment. But without further ado, I will hand it straight over to Martin, but I will be here in the background for support.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Just going to open up the slideshow for you. Give me just a second on that. Hopefully everything goes as it should. Just a second. And there we have the slideshow. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. As has been said, my name is Martin Beattie. I'll be telling you a little bit more about myself right about now. Okay, next slide here. My name is Martin Beattie. I am the Vice Chairman of the National Association of Drainage Contractors, also one of the founding members. I've worked in the drainage industry now for the last 34 years, and for the last 20, the bulk of my time has been directly in and around CCTV surveying for a wide variety of reasons, some of which I'm going to be talking to you about today. In my earlier years in the industry, I started off at Dynarod, as many of us did, moved on to Drain Doctor, then to a consulting company called Titmus. They're no longer around. Then I went on to a big civils company, John Murphy and Sons, working on the mainline sewers across London. Been Vice Chairman of the National Association of Drainage Contractors for the last 14 years. I'm a Director of DrainSafe, which I'll be talking to you about a little bit further later on. And I'm also one of the trainers for the National Drainage Academy, which I will also be talking to you about in a little bit more detail later on. But for the purposes of today, here to talk to you about a very, very important issue. And this is surrounding home extensions and about the importance of what we refer to as pre and post conditional drainage surveys. So I'm going to take this from the top and work my way through explaining each segment in as much detail as I possibly can. Starting off with the pre-conditional survey. Now, the pre-conditional survey needs to be carried out at the planning stage before you break ground. Most properties, when they're being extended, will need some modification to the underground drainage system. And it is imperative that the existing underground drainage system, as much data on that and information on it is obtained prior to that. Now, there's a number of items here, and I'm going to go through them with you. Obviously, you'll require a map of the existing drainage system or some sort of a diagram detailing where the drains are, where they're going, so on and so forth. But in addition to that, you will have what we refer to as the CCTV survey report. So in the first instance, you'll have the map detailing the drainage layout. But that's not the only information. I've got some bullet points here on the slide for you. So I'm going to talk about the first one, which is ownership. On a private property with a private drainage system, the entire drainage system on that property belongs to the owner. Nobody else is involved. But in quite a number of cases, you'll be on a shared system, which means part of the drainage system belongs to the property owner, belongs to the house itself, and another part of it will belong to the local water company. And it's important to know which part of the drainage system belongs to the water company and which is the private drainage system. A pre-conditional drainage survey will provide you with that information because you will need to know, is build over consent required? and that is also important. In addition to the map, the drainage survey will also tell you the depth of the drains. Now, in some cases, domestic drainage systems can be quite shallow as 300 or 400 deep. In other cases, they can be much, much deeper than that. I surveyed a property in Battersea just a couple of weeks ago, and the drainage system to the front of the property was over 3.5 meters deep. A big, big difference. Very important information when you're planning a new drainage system, because obviously the costings need to come into play. The next item on the list there is flow direction, the direction of flow. Which direction are these drains flowing in? Are they running off to the left from the garden, to the right from the garden? Are they discharging down the garden to the sewer, further away from the property? Or are they running directly underneath the property itself and discharging through a lateral main out to the sewer, which is located out in the main road? Again, this is very important information when you're in the design phase, so it's important that you know. I've listed shape, but in the vast majority of cases on domestic properties, and a lot more besides for that matter, the shape is normally circular. But the next bullet point there is diameter. Now, diameter is important. Diameter is important because we need to know what size pipework we want to reinstate with if we're completely doing a complete replacement, which in many cases we are. I always use the analogy, if you're spending money on a brand new car, you wouldn't put second-hand tyres on it. So why would you put a brand new extension over the top of drainage infrastructure, which has probably been in the ground for 100 years or more, especially in the London area where there are older properties? Diameter typically on domestic properties is either 100 mil 4-inch, as we used to call it, or 150 mil 6-inch, as we used to call it back in the old days. So it's important that we have that information. What is also important is the overall structural condition of these drains. Quite often when you're building an extension, you will only be replacing a segment of the drainage system. Some could be 10% in some cases, 30% in others. In some cases, it could be as much as 50%. But what's also important is you need to know that the existing pipework that you're discharging into is structurally sound, that there's nothing wrong with that. And the pre-conditional survey is designed to provide you, the designer, architectural technologist, with all of the critical information that you require to design that new drainage system. In addition to that, it will tell you 100% for sure, do you require build over consent or don't you? Now, I would say that every project requires a pre-conditional survey, not just to determine ownership, but to determine all of the other information. Because in the absence of it, how can you design a compliant drainage system? And I'll talk about compliance a little bit later on. There's, in some cases, 3 stages to a pre and post conditional drain survey. The one in the middle, sometimes people ask for it, sometimes they don't. The last time I done one was last Thursday in Kingston for an architect, and I'm going to talk to you about that now. We call that the planning meeting. Now, what is the planning meeting? The planning meeting is designed so that the architect, the builder, or both can have a meeting either on site or, like we're doing now, a Teams meeting with the drainage surveyor to discuss, and in most cases it's usually complex drainage systems. The straightforward ones don't really need it, but if it's a complex drainage system and a complex build, quite often they will request what we call the planning meeting. That's to discuss the existing drainage system, what's being planned for the new property. And when I say what's being planned, are they moving SVPs? Are they moving kitchens? Are they putting in utility rooms? Is the design of the new drainage system going to be severely affected by the assets that they're putting into the property? And what is the best way to lay the new drainage system? From my point of view, I've always advised architects that if you can run a dedicated line from an asset to a manhole chamber or an inspection chamber, then you should do that. Try to keep everything independent. So keep the SVPs on independent lines, kitchen islands on independent lines, utility rooms, independent lines, rainwaters on independent lines. And if that requires the installation of additional manhole chambers or additional inspection chambers, if you need an extra one, or in some of the bigger cases an extra two, don't cut corners. Put in the extra pipe work, make sure you've got dedicated lines, and there's reasons for that. It makes it easier to unblock if it ever unblocks, keeping costs down. It makes it easier for routine maintenance, and most importantly, it makes it easier to survey. And I'm going to talk to you about why the surveying is important in just a second, if you can give me just 1 second. So some of you may require a planning meeting, some of you may not, but most certified drainage surveyors will give you the opportunity to have a planning meeting if you so require one. And don't be shy to ask, they're all happy to help. I've included on this slide the approved document for the Part H, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. So we've discussed the planning meeting, but there are a couple of other instances where CCTV surveys are required, and I thought it worth, for the purposes of this, mentioning them briefly and discussing why they could be relevant. The first one, which is on your screen now, is home buyers drainage surveys. Now, more and more residential building surveyors are starting to recommend home buyers drainage surveys. The consequence of which is more and more people who are buying properties are actually having these carried out. And in doing so, in some cases, they're finding problems. In some cases, quite serious problems that have to be addressed. Why is that important? Well, it's important in the sense that if you're working on a property and you put in a new drainage system and all's well and the project's finished, it's every likelihood that at some point in the future, a home buyer's drainage survey or another type of survey will need to be carried out on that drainage system. So it's really important that we get the drainage correct. A number of reasons for that. I mean, if there's a faulty radiator on a property or a faulty boiler or a defective window, very cheap and easy to fix. Defective drainage can run into thousands and thousands if it's done poorly and it's done badly. And I can literally sit here all afternoon and tell you horror story after horror story. I'm not going to drive you mad with that, but I can assure you it does happen when the due diligence isn't followed. So that is home buyers drainage surveys. But what's more important than home buyers drainage surveys, and we've seen a sharp rise in this, not only in our industry, but in the pest control industry over the course of the last few years. And that's something we've referred to as vermin investigation surveys. I can tell you all now, and I can back this up with data, the vast majority of vermin investigations that we carry out, vermin investigation drain surveys that we carry out, are on properties that have been extended in the last 15 years. So much so that when people get in contact with us now and tell us that they've got problems with rats in their property, the first question that we ask is, has your property been extended in the last 15 years? I would have to say probably 7, maybe even as many as 8 out of 10 cases, this can be attributed to poor drainage at the point when the extension was built. Old manholes that have been left in underground but haven't been capped off, old pipework that has been left in underground and hasn't been capped off, or just poor workmanship from the outset. So important to consider that these drains will possibly need to be surveyed at a later point for a different reason. Again, the emphasis here is it's important to get it right. So that's the planning meeting, your option. Sometimes you'll need it, sometimes you won't, but the preconditional, very important. Once we've got past those two, that brings us on to the final phase. And that's what we refer to in the drainage industry as the post-conditional drainage survey. Now, the post-conditional drainage survey is there to ensure that the new drainage system that has been laid, or in some cases a partial drainage system, but the majority of cases, the entire drainage system has been replaced. It's there to ensure that, first and foremostly, there are no misconnections. Now, by misconnections, what I mean is foul water that is being accidentally discharged to a storm drainage system. Some properties have 2 drainage systems, one for the foul, one for the storm. An awful lot of them have what we call combined drainage systems, which handle both, so it's not really a problem. But on properties that have both, we need to ensure that the correct waste is going into the correct system. Stormwater into the storm system, foul into the foul. That's one of the first reasons. The other reason for the post-conditional is to ensure that the new drainage system has been laid as per the drawings, is complies with the Part H, and that it is fit for purpose. I don't mind telling you that I've gone to do numerous post-conditional drain surveys before the concrete has been poured, I might add, because that's when they're supposed to be carried out, and I've insisted that the drainage system be pulled out and replaced because it just hasn't met the standard. The only way you're going to know that it meets the standard and that everything's A-OK to proceed, pour the concrete, put in the underfloor heating and start the refurbishment is to carry out the post-conditional drain survey. Now, I would further add at this stage, ladies and gentlemen, those of you watching, that an ever-increasing number of building inspectors are becoming aware of situations and problems with underground drainage, and they are starting to make the necessary checks. So yet another reason to ensure that these checks are carried out. Pre-conditional, planning meeting if required, and the post-conditional. Just to give you an example, and it is an example, Thames Water receive approximately 14,000 applications for build over consent annually. 14,000. I can assure you that we are not carrying out, the drainage industry isn't carrying out anywhere near that number of pre and post conditional drain surveys, which leads me to be concerned of the condition of the drainage systems that are being laid, because I have to stress the amount that I've seen that have been very, very poorly laid, uncountable. I've lost count of the amount that I've told that I've insisted be removed and replaced. So very, very important part of the procedure is the post-conditional drain survey. Don't overlook it. So what have we done up until now? Well, what we've done is we've presented you with a problem and we've presented you with a solution. There's problems that drains aren't getting the due diligence or the attention that they should be receiving, and we've given you the solution to that. Make sure the pre and the post-conditional drain surveys are carried out. But it really doesn't end there. For the last few years, we've been carrying out our own research, and what we've found is that a lot of property professionals, and we're talking about surveyors, architects, structural engineers, all sorts, you name it, we've looked into them. They're very, very good at what they do. In fact, the best, probably the best in the world at what they do from the ground up. When it comes to underground services, you're talking about water mains, you're talking about gas mains, sometimes you're talking about communications. Quite often they come in overhead like they do here at my place. The most important that's underground, believe it or not, is the underground drainage infrastructure. And there seems to be a lack of knowledge. So what we've done in partnership with our friends at the WRC, that's the Water Research Centre, we've put together a course. But before I tell you about the course, there is just one other thing that I should mention. If and when you require a CCTV drain survey to be carried out, two things that you need to be sure about. First of all, you need to be sure that the surveyor carrying out the survey is properly certified. Most drainage companies in the country can carry out CCTV surveys. A very small percentage of them are properly certified. It really is your responsibility, if you're employing them, to make sure that they hold the correct certification. Now, on each of the slides, you'll see at the top, there's the NADC logo, and there is also a logo next to it, which is DrainSafe. DrainSafe is an approved contractor scheme from the NADC, and an awful lot of drainage contractors have already signed up to it, and a lot more are going through the process of full certification so that they can achieve approved contractor status. So that should be your first port of call. But always, always, always check that the surveyor in the field holds the correct certification. That's the first thing. The second thing is that they are producing the CCTV survey reports on what we refer to as WRC approved reporting software. And there's ample information in the field that you can find out about that, or you can contact me or Peter Henley if you require more information. But always make sure that you're using properly certified contractors. Don't use a guy down the road because he happens to have a camera and has got an idea what he's looking at. There is a big difference between certified surveyors and non-certified surveyors. Very important fact. So coming back to underground infrastructure, we established that or it became apparent to us, that a lot of property professionals were very, very good from the ground up, but when it comes to underground drainage, not so good. So we spoke to our friends, in particular a gentleman by the name of Peter Henley, at an organisation called the WRC, the Water Research Centre. They're based out in Swindon. They produce most of the manuals for the drainage contracting industry, the ones we were to, our Bibles, if you like. And we said, look, we've got an issue here that needs to be addressed. We need to put together a training course, a one-day training course, which covers everything that these guys need to know out in the field. And that course has now been completed. We call it the Certified Drainage Assessor. Different to surveyor, because you're not actually surveying the drains, you're assessing the reports that are produced from those surveyors. So on the screen now in front of you, I will draw your attention to what's included in that course. Module 1 covers drainage systems and components and design. That will give you a very good understanding of how drainage systems look, how they're laid, how they work, or at least how they should work, and how to address any issues with them at the design stage. Module 2 covers drain ownership. Now, we touched on that a little bit earlier on. Some parts of the drainage system might belong to the householder, the other parts of it, which are actually referred to as sewers. If a pipe is servicing more than one property, its legal definition is it's a sewer. Even if it's only 100 mil, it's defined as a sewer. But it covers drainage ownership. It also covers drainage law. And drainage law is also important at the design phase. So very important information there in Module 2. Module 3 we've touched on already to an extent. Reasons for drain investigation, in other words, a CCTV survey, when to survey and why. Now, we've touched on 3 of those. We've touched on pre and post conditionals. We've touched on home buyers. We've touched on vermin investigation. But the list does go on. There's a number of reasons why a drain survey would be required, again, by a certified drainage surveyor. Module 4 covers identifying the need for drain repair. Module 5, repair techniques and specifications. Like most other industries, we are advancing in technology, and most contractors are embracing that and bringing in new technology to make things easier and better and more affordable. And number 6, and that's probably the most important one, Module 6, is quality assurance. Everybody who is a professional wants to make sure that they're doing a quality job, that they've dotted the I's, they've crossed the T's, and they've ticked all the boxes. And Module 6 covers that under quality assurance. So that course is now completed. Let me take you on to the next one. And there's a list there of the target audience for that training course. So to name but a few: surveyors, architects, building controllers, facilities management, loss adjusters, local authorities, water companies, environmental health officers, structural engineers. The list goes on. That's actually an abbreviated list, what you're looking at. As I mentioned earlier, the course was produced by the WRC, and we expect that at some point in the not too distant future, probably the next 10 to 12 weeks, it will be an ABBE quality accredited training course, which applies to the built environment. So I'd imagine most of you will be familiar with that and will recognise it. And anybody that sits this course after accreditation will get the certificate from ABBE to say that they are indeed a certified drainage assessor. Very, very valuable if your understanding of underground drainage is not as good as it perhaps should be. There's an awful lot in there. There's a lot to cover. There's a lot to understand. Take you a little bit further still. The book on the left is something that we call the drain repair book. Now, I've included a link where you can go online and you can buy yourself a copy of the drain repair book, but it does accompany the certified drainage assessor course. So any of you that sit the course will be provided with a copy of that manual, and it is as valuable as any manual they're ever likely to pick up. It covers everything that you need to know about drainage, and anything that isn't in there. I've also included on that slide the name of the author of the course, a gentleman by Peter Henley, mentioned him earlier, and I've also included the link to his LinkedIn profile. So you can connect with him via LinkedIn if you choose to. He'll be happy to accept any new contacts, and the information is there. So, drain repair book, certified drainage assessor, very, very valuable. That's the second problem and the second solution. So in effect, or in summary here, what we've tried to do with this presentation is to provide you with, or highlight, 2 problems and give you the solutions. So here's the problem, here's the solution. This is an issue, this is what you need to do about it. Pre and post conditional drain surveys for extensions, and that doesn't just apply incidentally to domestic properties, it can apply to commercial properties as well, for those of you that work on them. So pre and post conditional drain surveys, and for certification CPD, which I know you're all very much into, we've developed the Certified Drainage Assessor course for you guys to come along and sit. And I'm expecting that to be, we're in April now, May. I'm expecting that to be rolled out probably from the beginning of June onwards. My name, as you know, is Martin Beattie, member of the NADC, Vice Chairman of the NADC, Drain Safe and the National Drainage Academy. My telephone number is there on the screen, feel free to call me. My lines are answered up until 11 PM, 7 days a week, and I do get called at the weekends, and I do get calls at strange hours of night, and quite often it's just for a bit of advice, and I'm more than happy to help anybody at any time if they're in any sort of trouble. I've also included my LinkedIn tab or link, LinkedIn link. If any of you want to connect with me via LinkedIn, more than happy for you to do so. That pretty much brings my presentation to a close, a little bit earlier than expected. So I'd be more than happy to spend a little bit more time here with you guys and answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you for that, Martin. What I'll do is I'll start with some questions, and if anyone has any questions, could you please add them into the chat box and we can field them to Martin. Martin, you mentioned that there was a number of issues that you notice when going in to do surveys, and typically it's where drainage has been damaged when extensions have occurred. Now it's become part of the process in your due diligence when finding out when you're booking in surveys. I just wanted to find out if there's any other things that you come across that are also issues.
I'm actually dealing with a property right at this very moment. I've got a site meeting tomorrow morning. I can't give you the address, but basically what's happened on this particular property, another contractor carried out the pre-conditional, which was great. We weren't available, so they called them in. We carried out the post-conditional. The building contractor in this case has added 4 new lines to the existing drainage system. We went into survey, our cameras went up anywhere between 1 metre and 3 metres, and then immediately went underwater and remained underwater right the way up to the end of the pipe, indicating that since these pipes were laid, and probably since the concrete has been poured, they're now back falling, which means they're not discharging household waste. One comes from an SVP, another comes from a downstairs WC, another from a utility, and another from a kitchen sink with washing machine. We've got to go back to site to meet the builder and the homeowner tomorrow. We're going to run the cameras up again, and we're going to look at it live. But the post-conditional drain survey has picked that up. Regrettably, the post-conditional survey was carried out after the underfloor heating and the concrete was poured. So all of this pipe work, they're going to have to break through all of that to expose it, correct it, and then reinstate it. In fact, when we carried out the survey, they had already tiled the kitchen floor and were in the process of fitting the kitchen. The post-conditional drain survey, and probably good thing to reiterate this, the post-conditional survey needs to be carried out as soon as the drainage system is laid, but before the concrete is poured. We find problems after the concrete is poured. Believe you me, it's a nightmare for all parties concerned.
Great. And is there anything else that you sort of notice that comes up that's associated with drainage that you tend to find that's clashing? Is it misunderstanding with contractors on understanding how to do the lintels over bridging foundations? Is it as you
Yeah.
mentioned that sometimes you have people who think it's easier just to sort of build over manholes and things like that? What's the sort of the red herrings that you tend to see on a regular basis?
For the majority, here at my own company, we work for a number of companies that are building probably in excess of 100 extensions annually. And they religiously carry out the pre and the post conditionals, and in some cases, the planning meetings. What we often find, and I done a survey on a property in Chigwell just a few weeks ago. Believe it or not, this was a home buyers drainage survey, nothing to do with build over at all. But when we sent the cameras up 2 branches to the right hand side of the manhole chamber, we found ourselves at the end of an open end of an open pipe, and we were looking at the wooden joists underneath the kitchen floor. So the pipe work underneath it was left open-ended since that extension had been built 15 years before. Now, that property could have very easily become infested with vermin, or if a blockage had have occurred further downstream and the drains backed up, it would never have backed up to the point where it was overflowing at the manhole, because it was just, the waste would have just poured out of those 2 open ends and flooded a huge void underneath what was a very, very sizable kitchen. In fact, the kitchen at this particular property was bigger than the footprint of my entire house. Big house here. And we couldn't believe what we were looking at. Of course, we went straight back to the bar and said, you need to get this addressed. That's one instance. In other instances, and while I don't want to point the dirty end of the stick here, husband, builders will cut corners if they can. And they will cut corners in areas that nobody is going to see. And the easiest place for them to do that, believe it or believe it not, is on the underground drainage. And we need to be conscious of that fact. Very, very conscious. My advice to anybody, if you're putting on an extension, is rip out the old drainage system in its entirety and lay a completely new drainage system. I've seen drainage systems that go from cast to plastic, from plastic to vitrified clay, then back to plastic, and it's basically a patchwork quilt drainage system. Not ideal. Not when somebody's spending £100,000 on an extension. So if at all possible, and if there's money in the budget to do it, replace the entire drainage system top to bottom if you can, or certainly at least within the built area. You can't expect them to change drainage outside the built area, but within the new built area, definitely change it, and do it conscious of the fact that this drainage system may well be surveyed at some point in the future, and you don't want them finding problems when they do.
Great. We've got a question in from Chris. Where a public sewer is being surveyed and is found to be blocked, who is responsible for clearing it?
Local
And
water
where
company.
and where that survey includes jet washing, etc., should the utility be liable for the costs?
Yes. If there are any structural defects to a public asset, say for example Thames Water, Southern Water, United Utilities, Yorkshire Water, Severn Trent, if it's on their asset, then they are responsible for the repair. No question about it. It is not down to the homeowner to deal with that. But this is where certification of surveyors comes back into play, husband. Certified surveyors will know pretty much at a glance what belongs to the household and what belongs to the water company. I could sit here again and tell you horror stories where surveyors have carried out surveys who weren't certified, weren't able to make that distinction, and have got themselves into all kinds of trouble. Not just themselves, the people that own the property as well. That's why using certified surveyors is so important.
I think also as well is I think you'll be able to add quite a lot to this bit. This question is you mentioned about the diameter of drain pipes.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing is obviously they start off quite small in the region of 100 mil, and then they go to
Yeah,
strategic size.
indeed.
It's potentially worth highlighting during this conversation that when you get to the larger size, if you are proposing a development, that could be a potential issue of basically meaning that the development can't move forward due to it being a strategic line.
Mm-hmm.
Up to a certain size, I think, if please correct me, but I think up to a certain size, you can pay for sort of substantive works of relocating and diverting and things like that. However, I think it gets to a certain size or maybe a certain set of pipes where they just can't be moved.
Yeah, I think, don't quote me on this, anybody, but I think most water companies will let you move anything up to 9 inch, providing you have provided them with a strategy for moving it and all of the data that they will provide you with all the data that they will require. And in most cases, the water company will have one of their field engineers on site overseeing the works when the diversion or the redirection is taking place. So it's not something that you could certainly wouldn't advise that something you attempt yourself. Most cases
No,
you want
definitely.
to bring in a professional civils contractor who does that day in, day out. That's not the sort of work you want to leave to a general builder. Building over with a build over detail, bridging detail, straightforward. Most general builders can handle that. They do it day in and day out. It's no big deal. It should be signed off by the building inspector before they proceed. So you're dotting your I's, you're crossing your T's there. But when it comes to any major diversions or redirections, you need to be talking to a structural engineer, bringing one in, and you need to be talking to an experienced civil contractor that deals with that kind of thing. Not the sort of thing you want to be attempting in-house.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, it's just good to highlight that nuance, because sometimes obviously on a drawing you might not look too carefully that there's drainage. You need to obviously bear in mind what size is that drainage. It's extremely important. You
It
touched
is.
on it earlier, and it's good to highlight that sort of a bit clearer.
It also
Um,
is.
I, Also, as well, I think one thing which would be interesting to sort of point before we leave this is understanding that there could be drops in drainage. So you could have a series of chambers which are of a certain height, and then suddenly there could be a completely different height as you
Yeah.
go into another phase, and that could
Drastic
all
change in
be,
invert level. Yeah,
yeah, that could all be within the same site, and that's something
it can
worth
be, and it often
highlighting as
is.
well.
It often is. Those particular components are sometimes referred to as tumblers, or in some cases drop shafts. So that's where you've got a deep sewer in the road, and you need to get the waste from a relatively shallow depth down to a deeper depth. There's also components in the field what we refer to as Buchan traps, as opposed to Windsor traps. Now, Buchan traps, quite frankly, I think they're a nightmare. I hate them. They're the worst thing they ever put into drainage. But they're there as well. They can often allow waste to drop fair amounts of distances, metre and a half in some cases. In other cases, it's normally within the manhole chamber itself via a tumbler or a drop shaft. But yes, depth of drainage is critical. And all of this information will be obtained in the preconditional. Don't leave it to the builders to do what they think's best, because quite often the builders don't do what they think's best. They'll do what's cheapest and wash their hands of it when there's a problem later on. So be careful.
I think that's a valid point. I mean, generally, it's there's a lot of unknowns in the ground, so the better you can make those unknowns knowns, you can obviously then uh, firm up prices and also make sure things are staying on track in regards to timeline, project timelines, etc. So that's a very valid point there, Martin. Um, I don't think we've got any other questions, but hopefully everyone's found that extremely useful. We've got a number of links that have been added into the document. This document will be shared to everyone that's registered officially on the website and the various channels where you could register. If you haven't registered, obviously you can reach out to our central office to ask for a copy of the presentation, or obviously you could contact Martin directly. Thank you for everyone who's attended. I just want to quickly take over for a second just to highlight a couple of events that we have coming up. So if you just bear with me for a second. Okay, so obviously this is the event that we've just had. So this is our CPD in 43 for the April 2024 series, and that's importance of drainage surveying. That's from the NADC, the official body who certifies drainage surveyors, and this has been kindly presented for us by Martin, who's a very, very knowledgeable and busy person in drainage. So thank you for that, Martin. Our next event, which will be our May event, is CPD in 43 for the 15th of May at 1 o'clock. That's a Wednesday. It's from ARC Jobs, and it will be on salaries, cost of living, national minimum wage, and many more items on that same subject matter. So please do sign up and attend. It should be a really interesting conversation. I think it's something that should be had, and we will hopefully have a very lively Q&A session as well. So I will stop sharing, and I will again thank Martin and thank all of you for attending today. It's very much appreciated. Thank you for the comments in regards to the poll as well. We will take a look at that and see what we could do regarding future events. Please do, if you do have anything that comes to mind, please do send that in to us. We're more than happy to take suggestions. And have a great month ahead, and we hope to see you next month. Thank you again, Martin, and we'll bring it to a close.
Desmond, thank you. Thanks one and all. Thanks for your time. Cheers now.
Thank you.
Bye.